It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Willow Creek, the kind of day where nothing ever seemed to happen. Until it did. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed lawns and picket fences that lined the streets. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect neighborhood, something was brewing. Something that would soon turn this sleepy town upside down. Enter Marcus Johnson, a man who had just moved into the area, hoping for a fresh start. He was no stranger to hard work, having spent years climbing the ranks in law enforcement. But what he didn't know was that his new home came with its own set of rules. Rules enforced by a group of self-proclaimed HOA cops who took their authority a little too seriously. Marcus had barely finished unpacking when he heard a knock at the door. Standing on his porch were two men in uniforms that looked almost official, but something about them felt off. They introduced themselves as representatives of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, and they weren't happy. According to them, Marcus had violated some obscure rule about the height of his hedges. He tried to explain that he'd just moved in and hadn't even had time to trim the bushes, but they weren't having it. Their tone was sharp, their words laced with an arrogance that made Marcus's jaw tighten. What started as a simple misunderstanding quickly escalated. Before he knew it, they were threatening to fine him, or worse. But here's the thing about Marcus. He wasn't just any new homeowner. Unbeknownst to these so-called HOA enforcers, he had a secret, a big one. Just days before moving to Willow Creek, Marcus had been appointed as the town's new sheriff. He hadn't even had a chance to introduce himself to the community, let alone deal with the power-hungry HOA. As the men on his porch grew more aggressive, Marcus remained calm, his years of training kicking in. He asked to see their credentials, but they brushed him off, insisting they didn't need to prove anything to him. That's when things took a turn. One of the men reached for a pair of handcuffs, declaring they were taking him in for non-compliance. The audacity of it all would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. Marcus could have ended the confrontation right then and there by revealing who he really was. But something held him back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the realization that this wasn't just about him. If these men were willing to go this far over a trivial HOA violation, what else were they capable of? And how many other residents had they intimidated or harassed? As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Marcus made a decision. He'd play along for now. But little did they know, the tables were about to turn in a way they could never have imagined. The men led him to their car, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows and a magnetic decal on the side that read, Willow Creek HOA Security. It looked convincing enough, but Marcus noticed the details that didn't add up. The poorly stitched badges, the lack of official insignias, the way they fumbled with the paperwork. These weren't real officers, and they certainly didn't have the authority they claimed. As they drove through the winding streets of the neighborhood, Marcus kept his cool, observing everything. He noticed the way people averted their eyes. As the car passed, the subtle tension in the air. It was clear that these HOA cops had the community on edge, and Marcus was determined to find out why. When they arrived at what appeared to be their headquarters, a small, nondescript building. On the edge of town, Marcus was led inside. The place was sparsely furnished, with a few desks and filing cabinets, but it had the feel of a makeshift operation. The men sat him down in a chair, still cuffed, and began to lecture him about the importance of following the rules. But Marcus wasn't listening. His mind was racing, piecing together the puzzle. Who were these guys, really? And how had they managed to wield so much power in this town? Just as one of the men pulled out a form and demanded Marcus sign it, the door burst open. A woman rushed in, her face pale and her hands trembling. "You need to let him go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know who he is." The men laughed, brushing her off, but she insisted. "He's the new sheriff." The room fell silent. The color drained from their faces as the realization hit them. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "That's right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And you're under arrest." But before he could say another word, the sound of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, and the room erupted into chaos. The men scrambled, trying to figure out their next move, but it was too late. The real authorities had arrived, and they weren't alone. As Marcus stood up, the cuff still dangling from one wrist, he knew this was just the beginning. The fake HOA cops had messed with the wrong person, and now the entire town was about to find out what happens when you cross the new sheriff in town. But as the door swung open and officers flooded the room, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just a few overzealous enforcers. There was something darker at play here, something that went beyond hedges and handcuffs. And as he stepped outside into the cool evening air, he knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. The story of Willow Creek was about to take a turn no one saw coming, and Marcus Johnson was right in the middle of it. But what would happen next? Who else was involved in this web of lies and intimidation? And how far would they go to protect their secrets? The answers were out there, waiting to be uncovered. But for now, the tension hung thick in the air, a silent promise that this was only the beginning. Stay tuned, because the next chapter of this story is about to blow the lid off everything you thought you knew about small-town justice, and the people who think they can get away with anything. As the flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the night, Marcus stood in the doorway of the makeshift HOA headquarters, his mind racing. The two men who had tried to arrest him were now in cuffs, their bravado replaced by sheer panic. But Marcus wasn't celebrating just yet. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know that when something looked too good to be true, it usually was. These men were small fish in what was starting to feel like a much bigger pond. The woman who had burst in to warn them, her name was Linda, as he later learned, was now standing off to the side, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked like she had seen a ghost, and Marcus couldn't blame her. Whatever was going on in Willow Creek, it was clear that Linda knew more than she was letting on. Marcus approached her slowly, his tone gentle but firm. "You did the right thing," he said, trying to put her at ease. "But I need to know what's really going on here. Who are these guys, and why are they acting like they run the town?" Linda hesitated, her eyes darting around as if she was afraid someone might be listening. "It's not just them," she finally whispered. "There are others, people in this town. They've been scared for a long time. The HOA, they're not just about rules and fines. They control everything. Who gets to live here? Who gets to work here? Even who gets to speak up? And if you cross them..." Her voice trailed off, but the fear in her eyes said it all. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about overzealous enforcement of neighborhood rules. This was about power, raw, unchecked power, and it was clear that the HOA had been operating with impunity for far too long. But why? How had they managed to keep the community under their thumb without anyone stepping in? As the officers led the fake HOA cops away, Marcus made a mental note to dig deeper. He needed to understand the full scope of what he was dealing with, and he needed to do it fast, because if Linda was right, then this was just the tip of the iceberg. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the sheriff's office for the first time. It was a modest building, tucked away on a quiet street, but it felt like a fortress compared to the chaos of the previous night. His new team greeted him with a mix of curiosity and caution. They had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. The new sheriff had already made waves, and it was only his first day. But Marcus wasn't there to make friends. He was there to do his job, and that meant getting to the bottom of whatever was happening in Willow Creek. He spent the morning reviewing files and meeting with his deputies, but the more he learned, the more questions he had. The HOA, officially known as the Willow Creek Neighborhood Association, had been around for decades. On paper, it was just a group of volunteers dedicated to maintaining the community's standards. But in practice, it was something else entirely. Over the years, the HOA had amassed an alarming amount of influence, with its members holding key positions in local government, law enforcement, and even the school board. They had their hands in every aspect of life in Willow Creek, and they weren't afraid to use their power to silence anyone who got in their way. Marcus's thoughts kept returning to Linda. She had risked a lot by speaking up, and he knew she was still scared. He decided to pay her a visit later that day, hoping she might be willing to share more. But when he arrived at her house, he found the front door slightly ajar. His heart sank as he stepped inside. The place had been ransacked, furniture overturned, drawers pulled out, and papers scattered everywhere. Linda was nowhere to be found. Marcus's instincts kicked in. He called for backup and began searching the house for any clues that might explain what had happened. In the chaos, he noticed something odd, a small crumpled piece of paper lying on the floor near the kitchen. He picked it up and smoothed it out. It was a list of names, some of which he recognized from his earlier research. At the top of the list was a single word, scrawled in bold letters: witnesses. The implications were clear. Linda wasn't the only one who had tried to stand up to the HOA. There were others, people who had seen things, heard things, and maybe even documented things, and now they were in danger. Marcus felt a surge of anger mixed with determination. He had come to Willow Creek looking for a fresh start, but what he had found was a town in desperate need of justice, and he was going to deliver it no matter what it took. As he left Linda's house, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He scanned the street, but everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. The normally bustling neighborhood was eerily still, as if the entire town was holding its breath. He knew then that this wasn't just about the HOA. This was about something much deeper, something that had been festering in Willow Creek for years, and whoever was behind it wasn't going to give up without a fight. Back at the sheriff's office, Marcus gathered his team and laid out what he knew. The list of names, the ransacked house, the fake HOA cops, it all pointed to a larger conspiracy, one that went far beyond petty neighborhood disputes. His deputies listened intently, their expressions growing more serious with each passing moment. They had lived in Willow Creek their whole lives, and they knew better than anyone how deep the roots of corruption ran. But they also knew that Marcus was different. He wasn't just another sheriff. He was someone who wasn't afraid to take on the system, no matter how powerful it seemed. As the meeting wrapped up, Marcus handed out assignments. Some of his deputies were tasked with tracking down the names on the list, while others were sent to investigate the HOA's financial records. Marcus himself planned to pay a visit to the HOA's headquarters, the real one, not the makeshift building where he had been taken the night before. He wanted to see firsthand how deep the rabbit hole went, but before he could leave, one of his deputies pulled him aside. "Sheriff, there's something you should know," the deputy said, his voice low. "The HOA, they've got friends in high places, people who won't take kindly to you poking around. You need to be careful." Marcus nodded, appreciating the warning, but he also knew that being careful wasn't going to be enough. If he wanted to uncover the truth, he was going to have to take risks. And he was ready to take them. As he drove to the HOA headquarters, Marcus couldn't help but think about Linda. Where was she? Was she safe? And what had she been about to tell him before she disappeared? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more urgent than the last. He knew that time was running out, not just for Linda, but for everyone on that list. Whoever was behind this had already shown they were willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their secrets. And Marcus was about to walk right into the lion's den. When he arrived at the HOA headquarters, he was met with a surprising sight. The building was a sprawling, modern structure, complete with a fountain out front and a flagpole flying the HOA's logo. It was a far cry from the shabby operation he had encountered the night before. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped inside, his hand resting on the badge pinned to his chest. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew one thing for certain. The fight for Willow Creek was just beginning, and he wasn't going to back down. As he approached the reception desk, a woman looked up at him with a polite but wary smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. Marcus returned the smile, but his eyes were steely. "I'm Sheriff Marcus Johnson," he said, "and I'm here to ask some questions." The woman's smile faltered, and for a moment there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or recognition. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Of course, Sheriff," she said, her voice steady. "Let me see if I can find someone to assist you." Marcus waited, his senses on high alert. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. Something was about to happen, he could feel it. But what? And who was behind it? The answers were close. He was sure of it. But as he stood there, waiting, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being played, that this was all part of a much larger game, one he didn't fully understand yet, and if he wasn't careful, he might just lose. The door to the inner office opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, with a confident stride and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sheriff Johnson," he said, extending a hand. "I've been expecting you." Marcus shook the man's hand, his grip firm. "And you are?" he asked, though he already had a pretty good idea. The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm Robert Hayes," he said, "president of the Willow Creek Neighborhood Association. How can I help you today?" Marcus met Hayes's gaze, his expression unreadable. "I think you already know," he said, and with that, the game was on. But as Marcus followed Hayes into the office, he couldn't help but wonder, who was really in control here? And how far would they go to keep their secrets hidden? The answers were out there, waiting to be uncovered. But for now, the tension hung in the air, a silent promise that this was only the beginning. Stay tuned, because the next chapter of this story is about to take things to a whole new level. Marcus followed Robert Hayes into the office, his eyes scanning the room for any clues that might give him an edge. The space was immaculate, with polished wooden furniture and shelves lined with trophies and plaques. It was the kind of room designed to impress, but to Marcus, it felt more like a stage, a carefully constructed facade meant to hide what was really going on. Hayes gestured for Marcus to take a seat, his smile never wavering. "So, Sheriff," he began, leaning back in his chair, "what brings you to our humble association today?" Marcus didn't mince words. "I think you know why I'm here," he said, his tone steady but firm. "Last night, 2 men claiming to be HOA enforcers tried to arrest me. They were operating out of a building on the edge of town, and they had no real authority. But what's more concerning is that they seem to think they could get away with it. So I'm here to find out why." Hayes chuckled, a low, almost condescending sound. "Ah, yes, those 2. Overzealous volunteers, I'm afraid. We've had to let them go, of course. We don't condone that kind of behavior." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Volunteers? They had uniforms, badges, even handcuffs. That's a little more than overzealous." Hayes shrugged, his expression unbothered. "We take the rules of this community very seriously, Sheriff. Sometimes, people take it upon themselves to enforce those rules a little too aggressively. We'll be reviewing our policies to ensure this doesn't happen again." It was a smooth answer, almost too smooth. Marcus could tell Hayes was practiced at deflecting questions, but he wasn't about to let it go that easily. "And what about Linda?" he asked, watching Hayes closely for any reaction. "The woman who came to warn them about who I was. Her house was ransacked this morning and she's missing. Care to explain that?" For the first time, Hayes's smile faltered just for a second. But it was enough. "I'm afraid I don't know anything about that," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "But I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. People in this town can be dramatic." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Here's the thing, Mr. Hayes. I don't believe in coincidences, and I don't believe in misunderstandings. What I do believe is that there's something going on in this town, and you're at the center of it. So you can either start talking now, or I can start digging. And trust me, I'm very good at digging." Hayes's smile disappeared completely, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "Be careful, Sheriff," he said, his voice low. "Willow Creek is a tight-knit community. People here don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble. You might want to think about how far you're willing to push this." Marcus stood, his presence filling the room. "I don't need to think about it," he said. "I'm the sheriff, and it's my job to protect this town. and that's exactly what I'm going to do." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Hayes sitting in silence. As Marcus stepped back into the sunlight, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Hayes was hiding something, that much was clear. But what? And how deep did it go? He needed more information, and he needed it fast. Back at the sheriff's office, Marcus found his team hard at work. One of his deputies, a young woman named Carla, approached him with a stack of files. "We've been going through the HOA's financial records," she said, "and there's something off. They've been funneling money through shell companies, and some of the transactions don't add up. It looks like they've been using the HOA as a front for something much bigger." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. "What about the list of names from Linda's house?" he asked. Carla hesitated. "We've identified a few of them," she said. "They're all people who've had run-ins with the HOA in the past. Fines, lawsuits, even a couple of evictions. But here's the thing. Most of them left town shortly after. Some of them just disappeared. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was unsettling. The HOA wasn't just about controlling the neighborhood. It was about controlling people, and anyone who stood up to them seemed to vanish. Marcus knew he had to act quickly, but he also knew he had to be smart. Hayes had warned him about pushing too far, and Marcus had no doubt that the man had the resources to make good on that threat. That evening, Marcus decided to pay a visit to one of the names on the list, a man named Tom Reynolds, who had been involved in a lawsuit against the HOA a few years back. Tom had left Willow Creek abruptly, but Carla had managed to track him down to a small town a few hours away. When Marcus arrived at Tom's house, he was greeted by a man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Tom's eyes were haunted, and he hesitated before letting Marcus inside. "I knew someone would come asking questions eventually," Tom said, his voice trembling. "But I didn't think it would be the sheriff." Marcus sat down across from him, his tone gentle but firm. "I need to know what happened, Tom. What did the HOA do to you?" Tom took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "They ruined me," he said. "I tried to fight them, to stand up for what was right. But they've got connections, Sheriff. People in high places. They made sure I lost everything. My home, my business, even my family. And when I wouldn't back down, they made sure I couldn't stay." Marcus felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice calm. "How did they do it, Tom? What did they do to make you leave?" Tom looked away, his eyes filling with tears. "They threatened my kids," he whispered. "Said if I didn't drop the lawsuit and leave town, something would happen to them. Couldn't take that risk. So I left." The room fell silent, the weight of Tom's words hanging in the air. Marcus knew then that this was bigger than he had imagined. The HOA wasn't just intimidating people. They were terrorizing them, and they were doing it with impunity. As Marcus drove back to Willow Creek that night, his mind was racing. He needed to find Linda, and he needed to find the others on that list. But more than that, he needed to find a way to take down Hayes and the HOA once and for all. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be safe, but Marcus had never been one to back down from a fight. When he got back to the office, there was a message waiting for him. It was from an anonymous tipster, someone who claimed to have information about Linda's whereabouts. The message was short and to the point. "If you want to find her, meet me at the old mill tonight. Come alone." Marcus knew it could be a trap, but he also knew he didn't have a choice. Linda's life could depend on it. As he grabbed his coat and headed for the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something much bigger than he had anticipated. The old mill was on the outskirts of town, a crumbling relic of a bygone era. It was the perfect place for a meeting or an ambush. As he drove through the dark, empty streets, Marcus's thoughts turned to Hayes. The man was clearly dangerous, but he wasn't acting alone. There were others involved, people with power and influence, and they weren't going to let Marcus take them down without a fight. When he arrived at the mill, the place was eerily quiet. The only sound was the creak of the old wooden structure. As it swayed in the wind, Marcus stepped out of his car, his hand resting on his holster. He scanned the area, his senses on high alert. "I'm here," he called out, his voice echoing in the silence. "Show yourself." For a moment there was nothing. Then a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a woman, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Sheriff," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry they made me do it." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of engines filled the air. Headlights appeared in the distance, growing closer by the second. Marcus realized too late that he had walked right into a trap. The woman turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness as the vehicles screeched to a halt around him. Men in masks stepped out, their weapons drawn. Marcus raised his hands, his mind racing. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he wasn't about to go down without a fight. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice steady. "You think you can scare me into backing down? You're wrong." One of the men stepped forward, his voice cold and menacing. "This isn't about scaring you, Sheriff. This is about sending a message. Willow Creek belongs to us, and if you don't back off, you'll regret it." Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew he was in a dangerous position, but he also knew he couldn't show fear. "You're wrong," he said. "Willow Creek belongs to the people, and I'm going to make sure they get it back." The men laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "We'll see about that," the leader said. And with that, they moved in. The tension in the air was palpable, the stakes higher than ever. Marcus was in over his head, but he wasn't about to give up. The fight for Willow Creek was just beginning, and he was ready to take it to the next level. But as the men closed in, Marcus couldn't help but wonder, how far would they go to protect their secrets? And how far was he willing to go to uncover the truth? Stay tuned, because the next chapter of this story is about to take things to a whole new level. The battle for Willow Creek is heating up, and no one is safe. The masked men circled Marcus, their movements deliberate and menacing. The glow from their headlights cast long shadows across the broken concrete of the old mill, creating a scene that felt like something out of a nightmare. Marcus kept his hands raised, but his eyes were sharp, scanning for any opportunity to turn the tables. He knew he was outnumbered, but he also knew he couldn't afford to make a wrong move. The leader of the group stepped closer, his voice dripping with malice. "You just don't know when to quit, do you, Sheriff? This town doesn't belong to you. It belongs to us. And if you keep pushing, you're going to regret it." Marcus didn't flinch. "You're wrong," he said, his voice steady. "This town belongs to the people who live here, and I'm not going to let you take that away from them." The Mao leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Brave words, but bravery won't save you." He nodded to one of his men who stepped forward with a pair of zip ties. Marcus's mind raced. If they got those on him, he was done for. He had to act fast. As the man reached for his wrists, Marcus moved. In one swift motion, he knocked the zip ties out of the man's hand and drove his elbow into the man's stomach, sending him stumbling back. The others reacted instantly, lunging at Marcus from all sides. He ducked under a swinging fist, countered with a punch of his own, and managed to knock another man to the ground. But there were too many of them. A blow landed on the side of his head, sending him reeling. Another hit him in the ribs, and he felt the air rush out of his lungs. He fought back with everything he had, but it wasn't enough. They overwhelmed him, pinning him to the ground. The leader leaned down, his face inches from Marcus's. "You're tough, I'll give you that," he sneered. "But tough doesn't win fights. Power does, and we've got all the power." Marcus spat blood, his eyes blazing. "You think this is over?" he growled. "You're wrong. This is just the beginning." The leader straightened up, his expression cold. "We'll see about that." He nodded to his men, and they dragged Marcus to his feet. "Let's go," the leader said. "We've got plans for you." They shoved Marcus into the back of one of their vehicles, binding his hands and feet. As the engine roared to life, Marcus's mind raced. He had to find a way out of this, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. He thought about his team back at the sheriff's office, about Carla and the others who were working tirelessly to uncover the truth. He had to trust that they would figure out what had happened to him and come looking. But time wasn't on his side. The drive felt like an eternity. Marcus tried to keep track of the turns, but the darkness and the disorientation made it impossible. When the vehicle finally came to a stop, they pulled him out and dragged him into a building. It was dimly lit, with concrete floors and walls that echoed with every sound. They threw him into a small room and slammed the door shut, leaving him in complete darkness. Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He needed to think, to plan. But before he could do anything, the door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was Robert Hayes. Hayes looked down at Marcus, his expression unreadable. "I warned you," he said, his voice cold. "I told you not to push this, but you didn't listen. And now, here we are." Marcus glared up at him. "You think this changes anything?" he said. "You think locking me up is going to stop me? You're wrong. People know what's going on now. They're not going to let you get away with this." Hayes smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're naive, Sheriff. People don't care about the truth. They care about their lives. And as long as we control that, we control everything." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Enjoy." "Your stay, Sheriff. It's going to be a long one." As the door slammed shut, Marcus felt a surge of frustration and anger. But he also felt something else. Determination. He wasn't going to let Hayes win. He wasn't going to let the HOA keep terrorizing this town. He just had to find a way out. Meanwhile, back at the sheriff's office, Carla was growing increasingly worried. Marcus had been gone for hours, and he wasn't answering his phone. She had tried calling the old mill, but there was no answer. Something was wrong. She gathered the rest of the team and filled them in. "We need to find him," she... "If something's happened to the sheriff, we're the only ones who can help him." They started piecing together what they knew. The HOA, the missing witnesses, the financial records. It all pointed to something much bigger than they had realized. And now, with Marcus missing, they knew they were running out of time. Carla pulled up a map of the area and marked the locations. They needed to check. "We'll split up," she said. "Cover as much ground as we can, and if anyone finds anything, call it in immediately." As the team set out, the tension in the air was palpable. They knew they were up against something powerful, something dangerous, but they also knew they couldn't back down. Marcus had trusted them to do their jobs, and they weren't going to let him down. Hours passed, and the search turned up nothing. Carla was starting to lose hope when her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. The text was short and to the point. "If you want to find your sheriff, check the old warehouse on 5th Street. But hurry." Carla's heart raced. This could be a trap, but it was the only lead they had. She called the team and relayed the message. "We're going in," she said. "But we need to be careful. If this is a setup, we could be walking right into their hands." As they approached the warehouse, the tension was almost unbearable. The building was dark and silent, but Carla could feel the weight of what was inside. She took a deep breath and signaled for the team to move in. Inside, Marcus was struggling against his bindings. He had managed to loosen them slightly, but it wasn't enough. He heard the sound of footsteps outside the door and braced himself. The door creaked open, and for a moment, he thought it was Hayes coming back to gloat. But then he saw Carla's face, and relief washed over him. "Carla," he said, his voice hoarse. "You found me." She rushed to his side, quickly cutting the zip ties. "We need to get out of here," she said. "Now!" But as they turned to leave, the sound of voices echoed through the warehouse. The HOA's enforcers were coming, and they weren't alone. The team moved quickly, taking up defensive positions. Marcus grabbed a piece of pipe from the floor, his eyes scanning the room. "This is it," he said. "We're not backing down, not this time." The door burst open, and the masked men poured in. The fight was on. The tension in the air was electric, the stakes higher than ever. Marcus and his team were outnumbered and outgunned, but they weren't about to give up. The battle for Willow Creek had reached its boiling point, and there was no turning back. But as the clash erupted, one question hung in the air. Who would come out on top? The answer was still unclear, but one thing was certain. This was the moment that would decide the fate of the town. Stay tuned, because the next chapter of this story is about to bring everything to a head. The fight for justice is reaching, It's climax, and no one is safe. The truth is about to be revealed, but at what cost? The warehouse erupted into chaos. Marcus swung the pipe in his hands, connecting with one of the masked men's shoulders and sending him stumbling back. Carla and the rest of the team fought fiercely, using whatever they could find as weapons: chairs, broken pieces of wood, even chunks of concrete from the crumbling floor. The HOA enforcers were relentless, their movements coordinated and brutal, but Marcus and his team held their ground. Every swing, every shout, every crash of metal against metal echoed through the vast space, a symphony of desperation and defiance. Just as Marcus thought they might have a chance, the sound of more engines roared outside. Headlights flooded through. The broken windows and the warehouse doors were thrown open. A new wave of men poured in. But these weren't the masked enforcers. They were dressed in tactical gear, their faces hidden behind balaclavas, and they moved with the precision of a well-trained unit. Marcus's heart sank. This wasn't just the HOA anymore. This was something bigger, something far more dangerous. The newcomers didn't hesitate. They moved in, disarming Marcus's team with brutal efficiency. Carla tried to fight back, but one of them grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back, forcing her to her knees. Marcus swung his pipe at the nearest attacker, but the man dodged and countered with a blow to Marcus's ribs that sent him sprawling. The pipe clattered to the ground, and before Marcus could recover, two men grabbed him and pinned him down. The leader of the new group stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Enough," he said. "This ends now." Marcus struggled against the men holding him, his eyes blazing. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. The leader crouched down, his face inches from Marcus's. "Let's just say we're the people who make sure things like this don't get out of hand," he said. "You've been poking around where you don't belong, Sheriff, and now you've forced our hand." Marcus's mind raced. Who were these people? And what did they have to do with the HOA? Before he could ask, the leader stood and turned to one of his men. "Take them to the holding site," he ordered. "We'll deal with them there." Marcus and his team were dragged out of the warehouse and thrown into the back of a van. The doors slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. Carla was sitting next to Marcus, her breathing shallow. "What's going on?" she whispered. "Who are these guys?" Marcus shook his head, his jaw tight. "I don't know," he said, "but this just got a lot bigger than we thought." The drive was long and silent, the tension in the van almost unbearable. Marcus tried to keep track of the turns, but it was impossible in the dark. When the van finally came to a stop, the doors were thrown open, and they were dragged out into the cold night air. They were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest. A single unmarked building stood in the clearing, its windows dark and foreboding. They were marched inside, down a narrow hallway, and into a large room. The walls were lined with monitors, each one displaying different parts of Willow Creek. Marcus's eyes widened as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't just a building, it was a command center, and it was clear that these people had been watching the town for a long time. The leader stepped into the room, his expression grim. "You've been asking a lot of questions, Sheriff," he said, "and now it's time for some answers." He gestured to one of the monitors, which flickered to life. The screen showed a map of Willow Creek, with various points marked in red. "This town is more than just a quiet little community," he said. "It's a testing ground, a place where we can operate without interference, and you've just become a very big problem." Marcus's blood ran cold. A testing ground? For what? He looked at Carla, who seemed just as confused and terrified as he was. "What are you talking about?" Marcus demanded. "What is this place?" The leader smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You don't need to know the details," he said. "All you need to know is that your little crusade ends here. You're not going to stop us, Sheriff, and if you try, you'll regret it." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted outside. The leader's head snapped toward the door, his expression turning to one of shock. "What the—" he started, but he didn't get to finish. The door burst open, and a group of armed men stormed in. But these weren't the tactical unit. They were dressed in civilian clothes, their faces determined. At the front of the group was Linda. Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief. "Linda?" he said. "What are you doing here?" She didn't answer, her focus entirely on the leader. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. "We're not letting you do this anymore." The leader laughed, but it was a nervous, uncertain sound. "You think you can stop us," he said. "You're just a bunch of amateurs." Linda raised her gun, her eyes blazing. "We'll see about that." The room erupted into chaos once again. Marcus and his team took advantage of the distraction, breaking free from their captors and joining the fight. The tactical unit was well trained, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard. The battle was fierce, with shouts and gunfire echoing through the building. As Marcus fought, his mind raced. Who were these people with Linda, and how had they known where to find them? There were too many questions, and no time to answer them. All he could do was focus on surviving. The fight seemed to go on forever, but finally the tactical unit began to retreat. The leader shouted orders, his voice filled with rage, but it was clear they were losing. As the last of his men fled, the leader turned to Marcus, his eyes filled with hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. "You have no idea what you're up against." With that, he turned and ran, disappearing into the night. The room fell silent, the only sound the heavy breathing of the survivors. Marcus looked at Linda, his expression a mix of relief and confusion. "What just happened?" he asked. Linda lowered her gun, her face grim. "We've been fighting them for years," she said. "The HOA, the tactical unit, all of it. It's just the tip of the iceberg. There's something much bigger going on here, Sheriff. And if we don't stop it, it's going to destroy this town." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He had thought he was fighting for justice for the people of Willow Creek, but now he realized he was in the middle of something far more dangerous, and the stakes had just gotten higher. As the team regrouped, Marcus knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. The fight for Willow Creek had just entered a new, more dangerous phase, and if they were going to survive, they would need to be ready for anything. Stay tuned, because the next chapter of this story is about to reveal the truth behind the conspiracy. The battle for justice is reaching its climax, and no one is safe. The stakes have never been higher, and the truth is more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The room was a mess. Overturned chairs, shattered monitors, and the faint smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. Marcus stood amidst the chaos, his chest heaving as he tried to process everything that had just happened. Linda and her group of civilians were tending to the wounded, their faces a mix of exhaustion and determination. Carla was by Marcus's side, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he knew one thing for certain. They couldn't stop here. Linda approached him, her expression serious. "We need to move," she said. "They'll be back, and they'll come harder next time." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. "Who are they, Linda?" he asked. "What's really going on here?" She hesitated, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "It's not just the HOA," she said. "It's bigger than that. They've been using Willow Creek as a cover for years, running experiments, testing new technologies, things they don't want the public to know about. The HOA was just their way of keeping the town in line, of making sure no one asked too many questions." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Experiments? Technologies? It sounded like something out of a conspiracy theory, but the evidence was right in front of him. The command center, the tactical unit, the way they had been watching the town, it all added up. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" he asked. Linda's face darkened. "We tried," she said, "but every time we did, they silenced us. People disappeared. Families were threatened. We had to work in secret, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then you showed up." Marcus took a deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had come to Willow Creek looking for a fresh start, but instead, he had stumbled into a nightmare. And now it was up to him to end it. "What's the plan?" he asked. Linda's eyes lit up with a fierce determination. "We hit them where it hurts," she said. "Their main facility is just outside of town. It's where they keep all their data, all their secrets. If we can get in and expose what they're doing, we can bring them down for good." Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then let's do it." The team moved quickly, gathering whatever weapons and supplies they could find. Linda led the way, her knowledge of the area proving invaluable. As they made their way through the forest, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set his nerves on edge. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that this was their only chance. When they reached the facility, it was even more imposing than Marcus had imagined. A high fence topped with razor wire surrounded the compound, and guards patrolled the perimeter with military precision. But Linda had a plan. She signaled for the group to split up, each team taking a different approach to distract the guards and create an opening. Marcus and Carla moved in from the east, using the cover of the trees to get as close as possible. When the signal came, they rushed the fence, cutting through it with bolt cutters and slipping inside. The alarms blared almost immediately, but they didn't stop. They had to keep moving. Inside the facility, the halls were a maze of locked doors and security cameras. Marcus and Carla moved quickly, taking out guards as they went. Linda's intel had been spot on. They found the main server room exactly where she said it would be. Marcus hooked up a device to the servers, downloading everything he could. If they were going to expose this operation, they needed proof. But just as they were about to leave, the door burst open. The leader of the tactical unit stood there, his face twisted in rage. "You really think you can stop us?" he snarled. "You're just a bunch of nobodies." Marcus didn't hesitate. He charged at the man, tackling him to the ground. The two of them grappled, each fighting for control. Carla tried to help, but another guard grabbed her, pulling her away. Marcus fought with everything he had, but the leader was strong. Too strong. Just as it seemed like he might lose, a gunshot rang out. The leader froze, his eyes wide with shock. He slumped to the ground, revealing Linda standing behind him, her gun still smoking. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady. "We've got what we came for." They ran, the sound of alarms and shouting echoing behind them. When they finally made it outside, the rest of the team was waiting, their faces filled with relief. "Did you get it?" one of them asked. Marcus held up the device, a grim smile on his face. "We got it." But as they made their way back to town, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The facility had been too easy to breach, the guards too few. It was almost as if they had wanted them to succeed. When they reached the sheriff's office, Marcus plugged the device into his computer, eager to see what they had uncovered. The files were staggering. Detailed records of experiments, financial transactions, even names of high-ranking officials involved in the operation. It was everything they needed to bring the whole thing crashing down. But then Marcus noticed something strange. One of the files was labeled Project Phoenix. He opened it, his heart sinking as he read through the contents. The experiments weren't just about technology. They were about people. The HOA, the disappearances, the intimidation. It was all part of a larger plan to control the population, to test how far they could push people before they broke. And then he saw it. A list of names, each one marked with a red X. His name was on it. Marcus's blood ran cold. They had known about him all along. They had let him think he was winning, only to set him up for a fall. He turned to Linda, his voice trembling. "Did you know about this?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she said, "but this was the only way." Before he could respond, the sound of helicopters filled the air. Marcus rushed to the window, his heart pounding. The sky was filled with black helicopters, their searchlights scanning the ground below. The tactical unit was back, and this time, they weren't holding back. Marcus turned to Carla, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Now." But as they ran for the door, it burst open. The leader of the tactical unit stood there, his face twisted in a cruel smile. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" he said. "You've played right into our hands." Marcus felt a surge of anger and desperation. They had been played from the very beginning, but he wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not ever. As the helicopters descended and the tactical unit moved in, Marcus made a decision. He grabbed the device and handed it to Carla. "Take this," he said. "Get it to the press. Expose everything." Carla hesitated, her eyes filled with fear. "What about you?" she asked. Marcus smiled, a grim determination in his eyes. "I'll hold them off." With that, he turned and charged at the leader. His fists clenched. The fight was far from over, and Marcus wasn't going down without a fight. The screen fades to black as the sound of gunfire and shouting fills the air. The fate of Willow Creek and Marcus hangs in the balance. But one thing is certain: the truth will come out no matter the cost. Stay tuned for the final chapter, where the battle reaches its explosive conclusion, and the fate of Willow Creek is decided once and for all. The sound of gunfire and shouting echoed through the night as Marcus charged at the leader of the tactical unit. His fists connected with the man's jaw, sending him stumbling back. But the fight was far from over. Around him, chaos erupted as the tactical unit stormed the sheriff's office, their weapons drawn and their faces masked in cold determination. Marcus knew he was outnumbered, but he also knew he couldn't back down. This was it, the final stand. Carla hesitated for a moment, clutching the device tightly in her hands. She wanted to stay, to fight alongside Marcus, but she knew what she had to do. The evidence on the device was the only thing that could expose the truth and bring down the operation for good. With a final glance at Marcus, she turned and ran, slipping out the back door and disappearing into the night. Marcus fought with everything he had, his movements fueled by sheer willpower and the knowledge that this was his last chance to make a difference. He took down one guard, then another, but more kept coming. The leader of the unit recovered quickly, his eyes blazing with fury as he lunged at Marcus. The two men grappled, each fighting for control, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "You're too late," the leader snarled, his voice filled with venom. "Even if you stop us, the truth will never come out. You're just one man." Marcus gritted his teeth, his muscles straining as he pushed back. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm not alone." As if on cue, the sound of sirens filled the air. The tactical unit froze, their heads snapping toward the noise. Outside, a convoy of police cars and news vans was speeding toward the sheriff's office, their lights flashing and sirens blaring. Carla had done it. She had gotten the evidence to the press. The leader's face twisted in rage. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think you've won?" Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he used the man's distraction to his advantage, delivering a powerful blow that sent him crashing to the ground. The tactical unit, realizing they were outnumbered and out of time, began to retreat, their leader shouting orders as they fled into the night. Marcus stood there, his chest heaving, as the police and reporters flooded the scene. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. The evidence Carla had delivered was already being broadcast across the country, exposing the experiments, the corruption, and the dark secrets that had plagued Willow Creek for years. In the days that followed, the town was thrown into turmoil. High-ranking officials were arrested, the HOA was disbanded, and the facility outside of town was shut down. The people of Willow Creek, once too afraid to speak out, began to come forward, sharing their stories and demanding justice. It was a long and difficult process, but for the first time in years, there was hope. Marcus became a hero, not just in Willow Creek but across the nation. His bravery and determination had brought down a powerful and dangerous operation, and his story inspired others to stand up against corruption and injustice. But for Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. He had lost friends along the way, and the scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. One evening, as the sun set over Willow Creek, Marcus stood outside the sheriff's office, looking out over the town he had fought so hard to protect. Carla approached him, her expression soft. "You did it," she said. "You saved this town." Marcus shook his head. "We did it," he said. I couldn't have done it without you. Without all of you. Carla smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. What happens now? She asked. Marcus took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Now we rebuild, he said. We make sure this never happens again, and we make sure the people of this town have a voice. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus and his team worked tirelessly to restore order and rebuild trust in the community. It wasn't easy. There were still those who resisted change, who clung to the old ways out of fear or habit. But slowly, things began to improve. The town came together, united by a common goal, to create a better future for themselves and their children. Linda, who had played a crucial role in exposing the truth, became a key figure in the town's recovery. She worked closely with Marcus and Carla, using her knowledge and connections to help bring about real change. But she also carried the weight of her past, the guilt of the choices she had made. One night she approached Marcus, her expression somber. I need to tell you something, she said. Something I should have told you a long time ago. Marcus looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. You don't have to, he said. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. Linda shook her head. No, I do. I was part of it, Marcus. Not the experiments, not the corruption, but the HOA. I helped them because I thought it was the only way to protect my family. But I was wrong, and I need to make it right. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. You already have, he said. You risked everything to help us, to expose the truth. That's what matters now. Linda nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. As the months passed, Willow Creek began to heal. The town held a memorial for those who had been lost, honoring their memory and vowing to never forget what had happened. Marcus, Carla, and Linda became symbols of hope and resilience. Their story a reminder that even in the darkest of times there is always a way forward. But the fight wasn't over. The exposure of the operation had sparked a nationwide investigation, uncovering similar schemes in other towns and cities. Marcus knew that the battle against corruption and injustice was far from finished, but he also knew that they had taken a crucial first step. One evening, as Marcus stood on the porch of his new home, looking out over the town he had come to love, he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Carla joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. You've done good, Marcus, she said. We all have. Marcus smiled, his eyes filled with gratitude. We're just getting started, he said. And as the sun set over Willow Creek, casting a warm golden glow over the town, Marcus knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The fight for justice, for truth, for a better future, it was a fight worth fighting. And they were ready. The story of Willow Creek was far from over, but one thing was certain. The town and the people who called it home would never be the same, and that was a good thing. The screen fades to black, leaving the audience with a sense of hope and determination. The fight for justice is never easy, but it's always worth it. And sometimes, all it takes is one person or one town to make a difference. Stay tuned for more stories of courage, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. Because in the end, the truth will always find a way.